So we're standing right now in a stand that's more or less inundated in its understory and midstory by what they call mesic species. Abrams up in Pennsylvania has called it mesification. And basically that's a process under which, in the absence of a regular fire regime, mesic, and particularly shade-tolerant species, move in and start occupying a lot of these mid-story and understory canopy positions. The problem there, as we can see on this forest floor here, is that abundance of shade that is now cast on the forest floor is preventing the establishment and successful recruitment of any of our mid-tolerant or intolerant species. So essentially, what a lot of our silvicultural practices should aim to do in stands like this, and this is a very common symptom of our stands here in the East, is to implement treatments, intermediate treatments more specifically, that address this inundation in the understory and target the removal of these mesic shade-tolerant species in our understory. The thought is that by conducting a mid-story removal, specifically addressing these saplings and full-size stems, is that you could actually increase the understory light levels by somewhere between 15 and 20%. And that might be enough to sustain some of our mid-tolerant species as regeneration. So, in the absence of fire, we have a few options kind of on the table to help address this issue. You could prescribe fire, which has had mixed results. Oftentimes, those implementing prescribed burns are so relegated to windows of time that the fire risk is so low that oftentimes the prescribed burn doesn't burn intense enough to actually cause the mid-story mortality that we would want. So, either in conjunction with fire or in replacement of fire, you then have either mechanical or chemical treatments available to you, each with their own advantages and disadvantages. Herbicide tends to be the most effective treatment in targeting specific stems for their removal and preventing them resprouting, which is another big issue. Oftentimes, burning doesn't necessarily result in the mortality of that stem. And in some cases, a single burn can just exacerbate the problem, where these things become top-killed, the stump sprouts are even more prolific, there's oftentimes more stems, and they grow even more quickly. So if you were to just utilize prescribed burning, it would often require multiple burns to get the results you want. Herbicide, again, effective in controlling not only the stems at present, but preventing those stump sprouts. And then the third option would be mechanical. And of course, you can kind of utilize these things in mixture. You could do a mechanical treatment with some sort of herbicide to follow up, all of which is going to depend on the resources available to you and the species that you're targeting. But we generally consider mechanical control to be the most expensive on a per acre basis. Prescribed fire is often the cheapest, and oftentimes herbicide control is somewhere in the middle. There is a concern that if left unaddressed, this buildup of fuels in the understory is only going to increase our fire risk. So the chances of catastrophic fire are potentially building here as we're building up the fuel loads in these understories. So what we really are attempting to approach, either with prescribed burning or we're trying to emulate it with either chemical or mechanical control, is that low severity to moderate severity fire that gets a modest amount of mortality, specifically targeting these mid-story stems, but we also may have some patchy mortality in the overstory. And again, we're just trying to get that light, a moderate amount of light, to finally reach that forest floor. It's about midday here. You can already see that there's a pretty extensive shading effect in this understory. Really, there's been virtually no recruitment of any regeneration in this understory, which is going to be problematic if maintaining oak is an objective. And in the absence of that fire, we're seeing that compositional shift to these shade-tolerant mesophytic species in these understories. So if left totally unmanaged, which much of our eastern forest is, we're going to see these red maples, our black gums, our sourwoods become increasingly common in our overstories, which could have negative ramifications both economically and ecologically for the forest resource out here in the east. So briefly, I just want to mention that we'll see differences in carrying capacity, or the amount a particular site can sustain in terms of the number of stems. We generally see this gradient playing out along physiographic gradients. So generally on these ridge tops, which we're nearing the top of, we generally see the soils get shallower and the amount of resources available diminish. So at the one end of that spectrum, where we have kind of a xeric ridgetop site with shallow soils, generally speaking, the carrying capacity is lower. So we see more of a sparseness in the number of stems supported. There's generally a fairly more open canopy above our heads. And you can contrast that with going downslope here. And just visually speaking from the top of this ridge, you can see that the understory is more inundated with understory stems, mid-story stems, and that the overstory, the crown, is a little bit more vigorous and full. So those resources are becoming more available as we go down slope. And we can kind of expect that the soils underlying these stems is becoming increasingly mesic as you go from ridgetop to valley down below. So it can be helpful to contextualize some of the data that you collect in the field by knowing rough approximations of what you should expect. And typically, throughout the east, you would expect stands, much like this one, to have about 120 to 140, give or take, square feet of basal area per acre. So that can be really helpful when you're reviewing your own data to make sure that your numbers are more or less in line with what one would normally expect. We may have 100 to 200 trees per acre, kind of depending on the number of overtopped and sapling or pole-sized stems present in that stand. But in addition to having about 130 to 140 square feet of basal area, we may also have about 50 to 60 tons per acre. And we typically measure things in tons here in the east. So in a portion of your stand like this, where you have a number of red maple as pole-sized or sapling-sized trees in the understory, you could expect, obviously, for your number of trees per acre to go up. These trees will be in intense competition as they grow. Some of these trees will gradually start to die off, and only those that are likely the largest now will ultimately occupy this growing space. So as these stands develop, you could expect that number of trees per acre to go down, but your basal area may remain somewhat stable. So we're here again in the Fishburn forest to talk a little bit about stand structure. So an easy framework to kind of work with that's well established in forestry is to think about stand structure in kind of a dichotomy, either as even-aged or as uneven-aged. So just a quick reminder, an even-aged stand is typified generally by a bell-shaped diameter distribution. So on your diameter distribution, you're going to have stem frequency, number of stems on your y-axis, and your diameter classes on your x-axis. And generally, in an even-aged stand, you would expect that bell-shaped distribution, which means we have a unimodal stand, about a single mean, with some variation on either side of that mean. We generally have one cohort, one age class occupying that stand. On the flip side of that, we have an uneven-aged distribution. Again, we have on the y-axis our frequency, number of stems, and our diameter classes on the x-axis. And typically in that distribution, we're looking at a reverse J, or a negative exponential curve, describing the number of stems across that entire swath of diameter classes. So in that case, we generally have a lot more smaller stems and fewer large stems. So this kind of muddies the waters of that whole idea, of that whole concept. So what we likely have here tightly resembles an uneven-aged distribution, where we have a high number of small stems, small diameter stems, and fewer large trees. But in actuality, what has likely happened here is that this stand was at one point clear-cut. So what we actually have is an entire stand that was initiated at about the same time. So all these stems, despite the fact that we have pretty large diameter differences among them, are probably all about the same age. And what has caused them to differentiate themselves are their sylvics. So the shade tolerance and the inherent growth rate of these different species has caused them to stratify themselves vertically in the canopy. So down below, we generally have more of our shade tolerant species, more of our black gum, our sourwood, our red maple, and our sugar maple. And then our mid and intolerant species are occupying the canopy space overhead. So the reason this is important to understand is you can now reasonably expect that if there were any sort of canopy disturbance, whether it's through harvesting or some sort of natural disturbance, what's going to replace those overstory trees that, because of their intolerant shade tolerance or mid-tolerant shade tolerance and inherently higher growth rate, are now above these shade tolerant species. If there's any canopy disturbance killing those trees off, it's these shade tolerant species down below that's going to ascend to the canopy and replace those species. Now, one of the reasons that's important to us is because, generally speaking, out here in the east, many of these shade tolerant species down below that are kind of lying in wait to ascend to the canopy are often less desirable from an ecological and economic perspective. So whenever we're conducting an overstory manipulation in a stand like this, we're likely going to be recruiting those shade tolerant species and causing a compositional shift stand-wide. So if the intention is to maintain, which it often is here in the east, to maintain those intolerant or mid-tolerant species, you're likely going to have to do some understory manipulations in order to start initiating some of that understory regeneration that is composed of species that you want. So when you do finally manipulate the overstory, you have desirable species down below that'll occupy that space. So we're here again in the Fishburn, about a few hundred yards away from where we were talking about stratified, even-aged stand structure. When we have vertical stratification of crowns within the canopy, we generally have winners and losers. Some trees aren't going to make it to the upper level of the upper strata of the canopy, and for a short period of time until they become released, are going to be relegated to these lower social classes, as we call them. So we recognize commonly 4 crown classes of each individual stem. So a stem could be dominant, co-dominant, intermediate, or suppressed. A dominant stem, much like this white oak over here, possesses a much larger crown and is in fact likely receiving light on 4 sides. So it's receiving light on it's receiving light on 5 sides. It's receiving light on all 4 sides of the canopy as well as the top. Immediately adjacent to it is something we might call a co-dominant stem. A stem that's receiving light on 2 or more sides, but not all 5. So it has freedom to grow above, it's not being overtopped by anything, and it's generally considered a vigorous stem. Now the co-dominant stem in your overstory is going to be your more common stem, your more common social position. Dominants are going to be more few and far between. In between your dominant, co-dominant, and your suppressed are your intermediate stems. And those are stems that are only receiving light from above. So they're just kind of poking their head through the canopy and are just getting light solely from above. Lastly is our suppressed, or our overtop. Suppressed and overtop are synonymous, are referring to the same social position. These are stems that are completely below the canopy profile. They're in their own strata, and they're just lying in the understory. And again, that vertical stratification that is determined based on shade tolerance and growth rate is manifesting here in these crown classes. So what's important to note about that is, in addition to inventorying your stand and noting the diameters of these stems, as well as occasionally the height, is noting the social position or the crown class of each stem. So you know what's likely to come up down the pipeline. You can occasionally have small diameter trees that are relatively tall, spindly stems that have made their way into an intermediate or even co-dominant position. And they're going to respond much differently to treatment than are these suppressed stems. And this comes into play when determining what you're going to be thinning. Generally speaking, if you're thinning from below, you're kind of focusing on the suppressed or overtop stems as well as your intermediates. If you're thinning from above, which is a little bit less common, you'd be thinning those dominant or codominant stems. So knowing something about the social position of each of the stems in your forest can help guide some of your management decisions down the road. Stems like these, this is a chestnut oak, would occupy some of our larger diameter classes. And this is often what's merchantable in any stand that you enter. The problem is that if this tree were to be released, or harvested, what's likely to come up would be this tree here. This is a black gum. Black gum has a market for plywood. It has some desirable attributes from a wildlife perspective. But in general, the profit you would fetch with a stem like this as opposed to a stem like this, even if they were equally sized, is going to be far less for this black gum than this chestnut oak. This chestnut oak is also obviously a producer of acorns, keystone crop for many wildlife species in the area. And of course, when we lose this oak component, which we would if we were to cut the overstory down without any concern for what's coming up below it, we would potentially lose that keystone species and the inclusion of that food crop that's generated by these species. So if we were to cut this stem and get an age as close down to the stump as we could, we'd probably find that this stem is about 60 to 65 years old. Much like this stem behind me is likely 60 to 65 years old. And this is a common occurrence here in the East, where not much in the way of stand management has been occurring for the duration of that 60 to 65 year period. So we do see this stratification based on shade tolerance alone, and we don't really see anything in the understory that's desirable to replace these larger trees. So before we can harvest, and although we have, despite that we have merchantable sized stems present, if we want to be silviculturally sound, we would have to make sure that we have something in the understory that is a desirable species to replace these larger trees. In order to generally conduct a successful harvest that also simultaneously recruits ample number of desirable species, be them oaks in this case, we generally throw around numbers of, ideally you'd have roughly 430 or so stems per acre. So you'd have approximately one vigorous oak stem every 10 feet. And we generally assume advanced regeneration of oak is likely to ascend to the canopy if it's at about DBH or higher. So we're usually focused on, instead of diameter classes, we're focused on height classes. For advanced regeneration to be what's considered competitive, it needs to be about 2 to 4 feet tall. At that point, it's likely to escape the browse pressure from deer and make its way eventually up into the overstory. So when conducting a regen inventory, you'd like to see evidence of having, ideally you'd have 400 and some odd per every acre, but we generally are okay with anything between 100 and 350 stems per acre. That probably means that you're going to see a decrease in the component of oak in your stand, but you're still maintaining it in your stand. And if really no consideration is taken for the amount of advanced regen that's present, you're likely just going to accelerate that compositional shift to less desirable species. So one of the more common intermediate treatments that would be conducted in stands like this, where we're approaching that late successional phase or we're in the understory reinitiation phase, prior to conducting a stand-wide harvest, we might be tempted to thin. And thinning can have a whole host of different benefits. In some cases, you could be opening up the overstory enough, again, to get some of that moderate light levels that you need to recruit some of your regen. You can actually cause greater diversity in your stand by intensifying the thinning on one portion of the stand and reducing the intensity in the other, called variable density thinning. But maybe the most standard and common practice is to basically thin in order to benefit the residual stems so that you can increase the growth of that residual stand. And that's really the common objective of any intermediate treatment. We tend to see that after we get out of the stem exclusion phase, growth rates tend to slow down. And with intermediate treatments, we're oftentimes trying to maintain that rapid growth rate and accelerate that stand to larger size classes. And those larger size classes may not just be attractive for an economic gain, but generally speaking, we see benefits derived from the trees within that stand are realized when those stems become larger. They generally are bigger mass producers. They generally are forming cavities. They have more complex crowns, which begets more nesting sites and other resources for wildlife. So accelerating that stand through the next stage of stand development can have both ecological and economic objectives in mind. So in this case, let's say we're looking to maintain rapid growth rate. We may go into a stand locating those stems that seem likely to lose out. And in this case, knowing your crown classes and canopy position can be helpful in identifying which of those stems should be candidates for removal. So right here we actually have a stump sprout, 2 chestnut oaks. And just visually it's fairly obvious which one should be removed. Not only is this stem smaller than its neighbor, but this one's also poorly formed with a pretty dramatic sweep. So if we were to remove this stem, it's likely that this adjacent stem would get a benefit from not only the increase in light, but also the abundance of soil resources that this stem is no longer utilizing would be redirected to this stem. We found that even mature trees, oaks among them, will respond positively to thinning treatments, even at large sizes and advanced ages. There's research that's showing 80, 100, 150 plus year old trees will positively respond to a thinning treatment. One of the best indicators of how well a tree will respond to treatment is actually how vigorous the crown is. So there are a couple of different measures of crown vigor. Obviously, the more green you see, the better. Crown length, canopy volume, in addition to canopy class, can give you a good idea of which of these stems is likely to respond positively to a thinning treatment. So on a larger scale, you may be looking out among your stand and identifying not only the species that are less desirable, but also those stems that are maybe intermediate or suppressed that are likely to die off eventually anyway. You're kind of accelerating that mortality and allowing any of those resources that those trees that are likely to just die in the stump anyway, any of those resources that they're utilizing can now be redirected to their neighboring trees to advance or accelerate their growth rate. So when you're implementing any thinning regime, it's important to refer back to those canopy classes that we were talking about earlier. The canopy classes are going to tell you which stems should be targeted for removal and which should not. One of the most common thinning treatments, often recommended by foresters and silviculturists, is a low thinning, or a thinning from below. And specifically what we're referring to there are stems of smaller size. Generally your intermediates and your overtops. Those are the stems that you're targeting for removal. So thinning from below is specifically referring to their vertical distribution in the canopy strata. When conducting a low thinning, you're targeting those stems of lower canopy positions, again your intermediates or your overtops, and you thin from below. So the amount of growth response you're going to have from your residual stems is not going to be all that high. These things are presumed to not be as great of resource users as perhaps if this stem were as large as its neighbor here. You might expect a greater growth response from this residual stem. But because we're just removing these smaller stems from the mid-story and understory, the growth response may not be great, but we're essentially cleaning this understory, improving the understory conditions for regeneration. So another common thinning regime goes by a number of names. Thinning from above, high thinning, crown thinning, where essentially you're less concerned about what's going on in this mid-story and more concerned about freeing up canopy space for your residual stems. So here you'd be focused on your codominance and your dominance, and targeting stems for removal that are likely to free up growing space above, increase the amount of light that's being received by those residual canopies, and increasing the growth rate. Now, in contrast to a low thinning, a high thinning or a crown thinning should result in a relatively high growth response in those residual stems. And again, even despite their advanced age, we could expect a lot of these stems to still respond positively to that thinning treatment. They will receive a lot more light, which generally these species can respond positively to, and their growth rate should increase. Now, with the hardwoods that we have here in the east, epicormic branching becomes an issue. As soon as you start thinning heavily, you start daylighting much of these stems. That could invigorate epicormic branching, in which the tree will send out new shoots laterally out of its stem, and that oftentimes will reduce the quality of that wood. You'll get oftentimes a lower grade tree as a result of that epicormic branching. So what you could do when the opportunity presents itself is retain in a high thinning some of these mid-story trees that are sometimes called trainer trees, that maintain that shade being cast on that stem, prevent some of that epicormic branching, while you still get to enjoy the growth response from the high thinning above and the daylighting that you're giving that foliage. So variable density thinning was developed more or less out of the Pacific Northwest. And the idea was to take a more or less homogeneous stand, meaning that structurally speaking it was an even age stand, diameters didn't vary dramatically in their sizes, and one would implement a variable density thinning in an otherwise homogeneous even age stand to kind of promote and accelerate the development of old growth attributes. Old growth or late successional attributes are really a desirable thing, a desirable objective in the Pacific Northwest, mostly for the maintenance of habitat for old growth obligate species. And with a variable density thinning, what you're attempting to do is diversify that horizontal structure, diversify the diameter distribution, kind of flatten that curve and see more representatives in the larger size classes as well as the smaller size classes. And so you can achieve that by essentially varying the intensity with which you thin within that stand. So some areas would be thinned intensely, and other areas would receive relatively light or no thinning at all. It's sometimes referred to as thinning by skips and gaps. So you'd be skipping some portions of that stand, not really thinning it at all, and other portions would be thinned so heavily that you'd be leaving gaps behind. The idea there being that you would more quickly get that common structure found in old growth stands by diversifying the intensity of your thinning, allowing some trees to grow rather large, while other trees remain in high competitive environments and don't really tack on a lot of diameter. So stand wide, you're seeing a greater diversity in the diameter distribution in what was otherwise an even age stand.